So we have some excellent presentations lined up for you this afternoon. Our first keynote presentation this afternoon is by Dr. John Roche. Dr. Roche is an Irishman who works for DairyNZ, and of course he will be well known to many of you as one of the most prominent researchers in the world in the area of dairy science. And the title of John's presentation this afternoon is Managing Dairy Cow Health Through Nutrition. John, the floor is yours.
Go raibh maige Finbar. Díomh a cóirde tá anáthaas orm a bheith anseo inniuh, agus tá súlagam go buinneamh sibh tainmh as an gogardas seo agus de cuairt in éireann. Ladies and gentlemen, just a couple of words of Irish to say, look, I'm delighted to be here today. I still have a couple of focal of Gaeilge in me, and that I hope you guys have a great conference and that you enjoy your time in Ireland. I come from a little spot of paradise about 180 miles to the southwest of here. So if any of you got a few loose days at the end of the conference and you want to go and spend some money, we always welcome you down the southwest of the country. We have a saying in Ireland that there are only two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of Kerry. So come down and see us. All right, how do I work? The green button, is it? Perfect. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I thought I got handed a little bit of a hospital pass here by the organising committee to go and talk about the role of nutrition in health. And I felt a little bit like this flamingo here, considering whenever I go and talk to veterinary audiences about nutrition and health, nutrition is either the cause of disease or it's the solution to disease. But it's a very, very hot topic of conversation, and I'm sure it's no different among this audience. So hopefully I'll leave about 5 minutes at the end where we can have a good old discussion about it. So it's a huge topic, absolutely huge topic. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to break it into different parts. So if we look at the life cycle of the cow, we've got the growth and development phase of the heifer, through to her first calving and her first transition period, and then assuming that she actually makes it through that, we have a cycle and successive cycles, hopefully, of lactation, transition cow, and so on and so forth. And so I'll break it into those two logical areas of work just for the presentation. All right, young stock has been a big interest of mine for a long time. I grew up in a pedigree Holstein herd, so my father was big into growing proper heifers. Yeah, he would probably disown me if he came across my recommendations for rearing heifers now. But we wrote a review, which was published in Animal Production Science last year, myself and a team that included Jim Drakely at the University of Illinois. And the major outcome of that review was that nutrition in heifer rearing, I won't say it was largely unimportant because that would be unfair, but people tend to focus on the least important aspect of nutrition, and that's in the post-weaning period, when the vast majority of the effect of heifer rearing on health in particular is in the early hours after the calf is born. So we define failed passive transfer, which you'll all be aware of, as 10 grams per litre of IgG or less than 10 grams per litre of IgG in blood of a calf during the first week post-calving. We know that we can ascribe 30 to 50% of pre-weaning mortality to failed passive transfer. It depends on where you get your reference, but it'll be in that range, 30 to 50%. In fact, 70% of post-mortem receipts in Ireland, of post-mortem calves that the path labs are sent in Ireland have failed passive transfer. Now, obviously, they get the worst of the worst, but still the 70% of them are failed passive transfer probably speaks volumes as to the importance of colostrum. And we know that calves that survive have lower dry matter intake, lower feed conversion efficiency, and produce less milk as adult animals with the limited amount of information that we have. Now, we've known this for a long time, and so you'd expect that failed passive transfer would be a thing of the past. Yet, irrespective of where you go in the world, from North America to the United Kingdom to Australia and New Zealand, the four corners of the round world, we still see 30 to 50% of calves with failed passive transfer. And of course, when we go out giving advice to farmers, we focus on the important things, what we know to be true, that the ability of a calf to absorb immunoglobulins diminishes very, very quickly with time, and the actual immunoglobulin concentration of colostrum diminishes very quickly with time. And so if you combine the two of those and cows aren't brought in to be milked quickly post-calving and the calf isn't provided with that golden colostrum quickly post-birth, then we're likely to get failed passive transfer. Some of the work that we've been doing in New Zealand, now this is unpublished, it's just literally hot off the press, actually casts doubt on that being the reason, or at least not being the sole reason. So everybody knows that the age of the dam affects colostrum quality, don't we? Usually we would say that the colostrum quality of heifers is not as good as old cows. However, if we look at the total protein concentration of the blood of calves born to dams of different ages, we can see that it has the opposite effect, that calves born to heifers actually have higher levels of total protein in blood, are less likely to have failed passive transfer than calves born to older animals, which is interesting. In addition to that, the method of feeding doesn't have a great effect, but it does have an effect. Now, these are across thousands of animals, and what it indicates is that animals that were not supplemented with colostrum actually have higher levels of total protein in blood than animals that were supplemented with colostrum, be it by bottle, feeder, or tube. And in fact, tube feeding had the lowest concentration of total protein in blood. Now, there's been debates for years as to whether tube feeding results in milk or colostrum bypassing the esophageal groove and actually ending up inside in the rumen and causing bloating and distress of the calf. And there's a lot of research that has been done that says that's not the case. So it's interesting to see this actually on commercial farms, that this is what we see. We see a lower total protein concentration in blood in calves that have been fed with a tube. But when we look at the data in greater detail, now these are bulk colostrums. We're dealing with large herds, so cows aren't milked individually and that colostrum taken to the calf of choice. A colostrum herd is milked and that colostrum is collected and fed to the calves, the newborn calves. And this is the Brix refractometer measurement of colostrum quality. 22, a measure of 22 is deemed to be high quality colostrum. And what we see is across 100 herds across New Zealand, across the North and South Island of New Zealand, we see an average Brix measure of 16, and less than 10% of samples of colostrum collected from those farms, actually it would be regarded as high quality colostrum. In addition to that, the colony forming units, which are supposed to be below 100,000, less than 10% of the samples collected were less than 100,000 total bacteria count, and less than 10% of the samples collected were less than 10,000 E. coli count. And so we're dealing with a situation where we've got poor quality colostrum stored in dirty vessels and probably provided to calves in even dirtier vessels. And that's probably a greater reason for the failed passive transfer, or at least as great a reason for the failed passive transfer that we see as the timing and the volume of feeding of the actual colostrum. So in summary, and this is where I'm going to leave young stock, because adult stock is obviously a far bigger issue, but the identification of golden colostrum, or the prevention of dilution of golden colostrum by not putting the 3rd and 4th day's colostrum, supposed colostrum, into the actual colostrum vat. The cleanliness of the storage containers, very important. The cleanliness of the feeding utensils, very important. And then we've got to ask questions about the quick removal of the dam. Obviously, there's other biosecurity reasons to remove the calf from the dam quickly, but certainly in this data set, it would indicate that that will increase the likelihood of failed passive transfer. But we may be able to overcome that by looking at some of the others. All right, moving on, adult stock. Well, if we were to focus in on the most important times, because I could spend the next 4 years talking to you about nutrition and its effect on diseases if I got into trace elements and mycotoxins and acidosis and everything like that. But if we look at the major timing of removal or death of cows in the dairy system, these data from Sandra Godden are quite stark, where they show in North America, across, I think, 500,000 cows was her data set, 15% of animals are removed from the herd in the first month post-calving, and close to 25% of the animals are removed in the first 2 months after calving. Now, nobody removes a cow to cull them before peak milk production. So this basically suggests that we've got somewhere between 15 and 25% of cows that don't make it through the calving period. If we look at a less intensive situation, in the New Zealand situation, these data are under review at the moment with the Journal of Dairy Science, but these are data from Chris Compton's PhD. And what they indicate is that there's a 6-fold greater risk of death in the first month post-calving in older cows, and a 3-fold greater risk of death in the month post-calving in younger cows than in any other stage of lactation. So as Jesse and all the other speakers talked about this morning, the transition period is a very important period. Now again, there are lots of and that's what I'm going to focus on. There are lots of reviews on the subject. I've written a number of them myself. There's plenty of them out there in the literature to get into this in greater detail, and I'm quite happy to talk about it in question time afterwards as well. But one of the things I wanted to make clear, though, it was, and Scott McDougall kind of touched on this morning with the similarities between Scott's data and the data that Jesse and others presented in the morning, is it doesn't seem to matter what system of farming you're farming. So these are beautiful data from Chris Reynolds at Reading University, where he shows the net splenchnic flux of glucose across the transition period, so from 20 days before calving to 80 days after calving. And what you see is almost immediately post-calving, you've got a tripling of the requirement for glucose, or a tripling of the release of glucose from the liver at least, which indicates a tripling of the requirements. And by the time we're a month in milk, there's a 4-fold increase in the supply of glucose to the peripheral tissues, including the mammary gland, compared with before calving. Now they're in high input, high output herds at Reading University. If we look at our data in New Zealand, again, where Scott talked about cows producing 3,500 to 4,500 litres of milk. Now, I do want to highlight, just in case you guys think we're milking suckler cows down there, that we have a very, very high solid concentration. So that's the equivalent of maybe 5,500 to 6,000 litres of fat-corrected milk. But what I'm showing you there is data in collaboration with Sean Duncan at Purdue University, where we looked at the expression of pyruvate carboxylase and phosphenyl pyruvate carboxykinase in liver tissue, again through the transition period. Now these are the 2 rate-limiting enzymes in gluconeogenesis. And the white bar is PC, pyruvate carboxylase. The black bar is phosphenyl pyruvate carboxykinase, PepsiK. We see a doubling of the expression of PC in the week after calving relative to just before calving. And by the time we get to 4 weeks post-calving, just like Chris Reynolds' data, we got a 4-fold increase in the expression of PepsiK. Identical, basically, the increased requirements for glucose in a grazing cow compared with a total mixed ration cow. Now, Jesse showed this graph this morning, which was a lovely summary of the work that Marcus Curley and the team were doing at Iowa State, looking at the functionality of the leucon, the lymphocyte and neutrophil function in particular in this graph. And what we see is a depression in the function of both lymphocytes and neutrophils through that early calving period. And a PhD student of mine, this paper is in press with Journal of Dairy Science. In fact, I think it might have just come out this month. And this is just one of the genes that she's been looking at in circulating neutrophils, not even neutrophils at their point of action, but circulating neutrophils. We see a reduction in the expression of L-selectin. And what this indicates is those neutrophils are less likely to get to the site of infection or the site of inflammation to clean up what they need to clean up. Again, grazing cows versus total mixed ration cows, 5,000 litres versus 12,000 litres. Very little difference in the physiology. Again, grazing cows, just like TMR and Jesse showed similar this morning, we're seeing 30% of body condition score loss in the first 10 days after calving. Now, most people think about body condition score loss as being this linear loss through to around 40 to 70 days in milk, and then the cow turns back into positive energy balance. But that's not the case. A cow loses 1/3 of the fat that she's going to lose, somewhere between 10 and 15 kilos of fat and protein in the first 10 days after calving. It's an astronomical mobilization of adipose tissue for a land mammal when you think about it. And that is absolutely driven by milk production. This was a graph that Jesse put up this morning as well. We didn't coordinate our talks, I don't think, Jesse, but there was this model, this mastectomy model, was an absolutely beautiful model to actually show us what the impact of milk production was relative to the impact of just the calving event. And of course, what we see in pasture-based systems then in terms of liver tag is exactly the same as what we would expect in a total mixed ration system, where the vast majority, thankfully, of our cows have less than 5% liver tag, but we're still dealing with about 10% of cows with greater than 10% and 40% of cows between 5 and 10% liver tag. And that would be regarded as hepatic steatosis. So we would expect downstream effects on these cows in terms of production, reproduction, general health with that type of metabolic profile. Very, very similar to what we see. So I just wanted to make that clear, that it doesn't matter what system of farming you are, it doesn't matter what you're actually feeding. This transition period puts the cow under incredible metabolic stress. So what do we do about it? A question was asked this morning, what's the optimum body condition score? This is a before and after photo. Those of you that knew me about 2 years ago, I was the guy on your left. I'm not anywhere near the guy on the right yet either. All right. So in a review document that we wrote for Journal of Dairy Science a couple of years ago, we put up this stylized diagram, which basically was to suggest that animal welfare, animal health and welfare, there was an optimum body condition score. And if the animal was below that or above that, she was disadvantaged. Now, we didn't put a scale in there, and there's 2 reasons. Number one, it depends on what time of the year you're measuring it, because the body condition score at calving is very different to the optimum body condition score at peak lactation, for example. But the other reason was, let's be honest, we didn't know. The vast majority of information looking at the effect of body condition score on animal health is epidemiological. We look at mastitis incidence, we look at metritis incidence, and we go back and we look at body condition score at points in time, and we see an association and we draw a cause and effect. And there's no, or prior to this anyway, there was certainly very little consistency in the literature on that. And it is true that there is an optimum. We've done a lot of work on this, and there's been a lot of work done around the world. A lot of it's contained in those reviews that I mentioned earlier on the optimum body condition score. But this slide actually answers, or goes some way to answer, the question that was asked earlier this morning on what is the optimum body condition score. What you've got is, in both of these graphs, you've got 3 lines. The dark line with the squares is cows that calved at a body condition score of 5.5 in our 10-point system, which is the equivalent of 3.25 in a 5-point system. The dashed line is cows calving at about 2.75 in a 5-point system. And the dotted line is cows calving at about 2.25, so pretty thin in a 5-point system. What we see on the left-hand side is cows that were fatter at calving have a far greater proportion of them in the weeks post-calving having hyperketonemia, greater than 1.4 millimoles per litre of beta-hydroxybutyrate in blood. In fact, 40% of cows calving at 3.25 in a research environment, so manicured, not in a commercial herd where they'd be under far more stress, and well-fed after calving, 40% of them are exhibiting a profile of hyperketonemia. Any animals that calve at 2.75 or below, no prevalence at all of hyperketonemia through the post-calving period. And that's mimicked in the NEFA after calving, as you'd expect. Now, this has been known for a long time. Charles Darwin talked about the effect of adiposity and its effect on intake and body condition score loss after calving. So we've known these for a long time. Now, so fatter animals, a greater risk of things like ketosis and associated diseases that were talked about this morning. A lot of data up here, so I don't expect you guys to look at it, but in particular, I wanted to draw our attention to 2 particular lines. Now, this is leukocytosis, and what we see is an increase in white blood cell numbers in leukocytosis with a reduction in body condition score. But fascinatingly, we see a reduction, a significant reduction in the neutrophil count in the leucon in very thin cows. So on one hand, we've got an increase in the amount of white blood cells that are circulating in blood. On the other hand, we've got a reduced number of neutrophils in that. And we'd have to conclude from that those animals are likely at an increased risk of infectious diseases. So if I was to put some figures around that graph, I will come to an optimum in a second. What we're saying is animals that are too thin are at increased risk of infectious diseases, animals that are too fat are an increased risk of metabolic diseases, and several of the presenters this morning touched on this as well. So what can I do? And this is a question I get asked every year. I have to thank my lucky stars that New Zealand is a seasonal system. We calve within 6 weeks because it means I get about 8 months of peace and quiet. And the other 4 months are debating what can be done after the horse is bolted. So bear with me a second. I'm going to take my time to go through this. And one of the presenters this morning, Dr. Mann, apologized for simplifying the insulin receptor data that she was presenting. If she had to apologize, I have to apologize profusely, because I'm now bringing it down to a bucket chemist sort of level. And I borrowed this slide off Professor Matt Lucy at the University of Missouri because I thought it summed it up beautifully. So if we look at normal state, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary to produce growth hormone. Growth hormone acts on receptors in the liver and increases gluconeogenesis, producing more glucose, and that glucose is used by the mammary gland to produce milk. To produce milk lactose, to produce the carbon shell of de novo synthesized fatty acids, and to help in the production of some of the proteins. There's also growth hormone receptors in the adipose tissue, and growth hormone acts on these to cause net NEFA release. These NEFA are also taken up by the mammary gland for milk fat. As well as increasing gluconeogenesis, growth hormone acting through the growth hormone receptor causes the production of a hormone called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. And that acts on the hypothalamus to shut down the production of growth hormone. So this is what we call the somatotropic axis, where the hypothalamus or the pituitary releases growth hormone. It acts on the growth hormone receptor, produce IGF-1. IGF-1 shuts down the production of growth hormone. So these two hormones effectively keep themselves in check. That's the somatotropic axis. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's actually, in fact, it's complicated by insulin as a hormone. Because we know in a normal steady state environment, if we produce more glucose than is needed by peripheral tissues, we see a massive and rapid increase in insulin production by the pancreas. Insulin acts on the insulin receptor in both the liver and the adipose tissue. Acting on the liver, it reduces gluconeogenesis, and it also causes the uptake of glucose to store as glycogen. Again, not really in a ruminant, but this was for a monogastric type system. And acts on the insulin receptor in the adipose tissue to lead to the uptake of glucose. Again, not in a ruminant, but it certainly reduces the action of hormone-sensitive lipase and reduces the net release of NEFA from adipose tissue. Now, it's getting complex. Growth hormone has a negative effect. These dotted lines are negative, has a negative effect on the insulin receptor, as does circulating NEFA. This is the entire metabolic syndrome that we deal with in human medicine at the moment. Insulin receptor stimulates the production of the growth hormone receptor. So this is all the entire somatic tropic axis hopefully coming together for you. And what we see, if I can go back, what did I see? Oh yeah, so if we increase the amount of insulin, we increase the growth hormone receptor, we increase the amount of IGF-1, and we reduce the amount of growth hormone that's being produced. And that's effectively what happens in a steady state environment if we don't have a big parasite sitting between the back legs of the cow, sucking every bit of glucose that it can get its hands on. I'll just move on from this. I've talked about it enough probably. So that's the somatotropic axis. So what does all that mean? Well, this was some seminal work done out of Matt Lucy's lab in the 90s and published by Kobayashi back in 1998. And what you're looking at here in terms of this blot, I want you to focus on the growth hormone receptor 1A and the IGF-1 total as part of the somatotropic axis. So this is 2 weeks before calving, around calving. These are cow numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, small numbers of animals. Back then it was a laborious task to do any level of transcription. And 3 weeks post-calving, and the darkness of these blots indicates the abundance of messenger RNA for these different genes. And so what you can see is before calving, we've got growth hormone receptor 1A is expressed in the liver, IGF-1 total is expressed in the liver as would be expected with the somatotropic axis. But around calving, we've got no expression, or virtually no expression of growth hormone receptor 1A, and we've got virtually no expression of IGF-1 total. Now, it's easier if you look at it over here on these bar graphs where it's quantified. So growth hormone receptor 1A, the white bar is before calving, the striped bar is at calving, and the dark bar is 21 days after calving. You can see a downregulation in growth hormone receptor 1A, a downregulation in IGF-1 2, and as a result of that, a lowering of the concentration of IGF-1 in blood, here in this bottom graph. For those sitting behind the pillars, graph D in the center. The bar in the middle is IGF-1 concentrations around calving, significantly lower than before and after calving. And of course, because of that, up on the right-hand side, we see an increase in blood NEFA, an increase in growth hormone production, and a significant drop in plasma IGF-1 concentration that rises as we get further post-calving. Now, why is that interesting? Well, I'm not going to spend as much time on the growth hormone axis with this cartoon, but again, I borrowed this off Matt Lucy. And why it's interesting is, in a simplified form, growth hormone acts on the growth hormone receptor to produce IGF-1. IGF-1 works backwards to shut down growth hormone. They keep themselves in check. If we knock out growth hormone at calving, we shut down IGF-1 production, as I just showed you on those last bars, which takes the brakes off growth hormone production, and therefore we get more growth hormone produced. The growth hormone receptor in the adipose tissue is still alive and well and functioning well, and so we see this massive release of adipose tissue in the first 2 weeks after calving. The interesting thing is, this is not a parturition-related event. The top bar here is dairy cows. The bottom bar here is beef suckler cows. And so again, at parturition, the top line of both of them is growth hormone receptor 1A. You can see at calving, we see this downregulation of the growth hormone receptor, which is it's followed by a downregulation of IGF-1. We do not see the same thing at all in beef cattle. So this is not a parturition-related event. It's not a bovine parturition-related event. In fact, if we go back to some of the data, and these are dairy breeds, dairy genetic strains that we've got in New Zealand, an experiment that we ran, we ran various forms of it for nearly a decade ago. And this again was work that Matt did with some of us down when he was on sabbatical in New Zealand. And what you're looking at, the blue bar on the left the graph on the left is growth hormone receptor 1A. The graph on the right is plasma IGF-1. The blue bar is New Zealand low. It's a low genotype. It's equivalent to the genetics we were milking in the 1970s. The red bar in the middle, the burgundy bar, or whatever color it is the modern genetics that we had at the turn of the millennium in New Zealand. And the OSH is the North American Holstein, North American Dutch Holstein. It was basically across those genetic strains. So very much a cow that was selected purely on the basis of milk production, a cow that was selected for functional traits as well as milk production, and a cow that was virtually unselected. So it was a really interesting model. Before calving, you can see there's no difference in the expression of growth hormone receptor at day -7, but by day +7, there is a massive difference in the expression of growth hormone receptor. Again, the 1970s animal, just like the beef cow, we didn't see a depression in growth hormone receptor, and she increased in growth hormone receptor very, very quickly. Whereas the New Zealand animal diminished in growth hormone receptor abundance in the week after calving. That stayed down for about 4 weeks, and then she increased. And if we compare that to the North American Holstein, she diminished by more, at least numerically, in the first week. She stayed low for longer, and even by 12 weeks post-calving, she hadn't returned. And we see that mimicked in blood IGF-1 concentrations, just to show that the actual mRNA is reflecting what's happening in the somatotropic axis. And what that resulted in was differences in a body condition score profile between these different strains. So you got the New Zealand 70s animal is the top line in all three of those graphs. The New Zealand 1990s animal, or 2000s animal, is the middle line, and the North American Dutch type Holstein is the animal at the bottom. And as you can see, the deterioration in body condition score that was obvious with the uncoupled somatotropic axis got worse with age, which is something that we see in these different strains periodically. So that has led to the argument that I see all over the world that we've bred a Ferrari, and why would we put 91 octane fuel in a Ferrari? That cow actually needs to be fed something else. Interestingly enough though, all of our data, and this is across the world, and this is going back, it's actually 30 years ago this year, since John McNamara and Joe Hilliers published their molecular data on lipogenesis and lipolysis in early lactation. And basically that there is no difference. The red line here is cows being fed a total mixed ration. Cows of the same genotype being fed a total mixed ration. These are cows the same genotype but being fed a pasture-only diet. The actual rate of mobilization of body tissue for the first 25 to 30 days post-calving is identical in both of those diets. If I go a step further and show you cows that I underfed, I don't like to use the word starved, but in an experimental setting, I underfed them. And just to prove that I underfed them, this is their milk production. For the first 5 weeks of lactation, the treatment was imposed compared with the cows that were reasonably well fed. There's a pre-calving effective treatment here as well. The treatment ended 5 weeks in, and you can see the carryover effect of the gross undernutrition. So the cows were grossly underfed. If we look at the body condition score after calving of those two different groups, these two groups, this open diamond are cows that were fully fed. The closed diamond are cows that were restricted by 50%. Again, the open square are cows that were fully fed. The closed square are cows that were restricted by 50% for the first 5 weeks of lactation. John McNamara and Joe Hillier's data were very, very clear. Body condition score is being mobilized at a maximum rate for the first 4 weeks after calving. It cannot be increased. If you starve an animal, if you underfeed an animal, if you milk her 3 times a day, if you alter the diet, you will not alter the trajectory of loss of body condition in the first 3 to 4 weeks post-calving in a healthy animal, in an otherwise healthy animal. In addition to that, lipogenesis is stopped at calving, and it is not reinstated until about 4 weeks post-calving. And so for that first 3 to 4 weeks period, it doesn't matter if you milk cows once a day or 6 times a day. It doesn't matter if you feed them pasture or a total mixed ration. We do not see a change in the trajectory of body condition score loss or a large change in circulating NEFA concentrations. We can see a large change in beta-hydroxybutyrate, but that's a different thing. All right, so in summary, in terms of body condition score is important in cow health. There's no question about it. But generally speaking, as I intimated earlier, usually the horse is bolted by the time anyone comes to me to shut the stable door. Calving is the time that we have an opportunity to manipulate this. We do not have a large opportunity to manipulate this through nutrition in early lactation. So calving body condition score is most important. The optimum is somewhere between 2.75 and 3.25 in a 5-point scale, or between 4.5 and 5.5 in a 10-point scale that we would use. And the reason why I say that is Phil Garnsworthy has been banging on for 30 years now that we're calving cows too fat. He's been recommending 2.75 since the mid-1980s. And many of the systems in the United Kingdom have adopted that. And I'll come to that in a second because it does have implications for some of our transition cow management. We recommend a body condition score of 5 in New Zealand, or a body condition score of 3 in a 5-point scale. So do the Australians. And then I see different places in the world recommending somewhere between 3.25 and 3.5. All I'm saying is that the upper end of that program, at the upper end of that scale, you're increasing the likelihood of metabolic disease should anything go wrong. And in our type of system, where cows are outdoors and subjected to storms and rain and vents and things like that, there's a high likelihood that animal will be restricted at some stage in her life, and therefore actually veering to the 2.75 to 3 is a good insurance against metabolic disease. Anything below that is going to increase the risk of infectious disease. All right, transition cow nutrition. Now, I think it was Mark Twain that used to say, just when enough has been said, some fool has to add to it. And we've spent the entire morning talking about transition cow nutrition, and I guess this fool has got to add to it. But what I would argue is you need to be aware of dogma. And the dogma that I'm particularly thinking of, and I think Jesse touched on this as well in his talk earlier this morning, originates in 1928. Robert Boatflower of Harper Adams University identified 4 limiting factors, or four most limiting factors for the cow's next milk production. The lack of control of indigestible fiber, we still talk about it. The lack of control of the total amount of food fed, certainly in the pasture-based system, we still talk about it. The neglect of the preparation of the cow for her next lactation period, and the overstocking of the udder. So he wasn't a fan of once-a-day milking back in 1928. So what I'm going to particularly focus on is the neglect of the preparation of the cow for her next lactation. It's a really interesting passage in this book. It's a musty old book that I've got sitting on my shelf back at work. And Bobby Boatflower introduced the term steaming up cows. So when I was going through university, I thought steaming up was a new concept that had originated in the 1980s. But it was back in the mid-1920s that it was first introduced. And it was supported by research. There's lots of research through the 60s and 70s that showed that animals that were fed more in the weeks before calving produced more milk than animals that were restricted. But when you really delve into those studies, the animals that were restricted were grossly underfed. And I'll come to that in a few minutes. So it wasn't truly a good comparison. And because most of our body condition score systems were only devised in the 1970s, we don't really have a good handle of what the body condition score of those cows were. And that interacts with as well, which I'll come to it in a second. But there was some real seminal work undertaken in the 1990s. This was a beautiful experiment undertaken by the team at Wisconsin, Sandra Bertix and Rick Grummer, published in 1992. And why it was so beautiful was just a lovely experimental model, a bit like the mastectomy model that Jesse talked about earlier, where they fistulated cows. And they compared the natural drop, and I use the word natural liberally in inverted commas, the natural drop in dry matter intake before calving with force-fed cows. They were force-fed through the rumen fistula. And what they found was cows that were fully fed before calving had 50% lower liver triglycerides at calving. So that's obviously a good thing, isn't it? On top of that, Paul Dick in his master's at Michigan State University showed a correlation between blood NEFA before calving and the risk of virtually every disease other than milk fever after calving. So cows that had increased levels of NEFA before calving had a greater risk of metabolic disease. Now, I saw Morgan Sheehy from Ireland present similar data on beta-hydroxybutyrate a couple of years ago at ADSA. So again, cows with higher levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate before calving, greater risk of metabolic diseases after calving. So the conclusion from that work was that increased NEFA before calving was associated with increased disease after. And of course, increased NEFA is due to body condition score loss. Body condition score loss is due to underfeeding. So the long bow that's been drawn is that cows that are underfed before calving are at an increased risk of metabolic disease after calving, metabolic and infectious disease. But then another beautiful piece of work done out of British Columbia, part of Julie Hussey's master's in Marina van Kuyseling's group at British Columbia, where she looked at dry matter intake of cows that had metritis. And this is very similar to data that Jesse showed from the Iowa lab earlier this morning as well. So the black bar at the top, or the black diamonds at the top are cows that are healthy. The middle squares are cows that have a discharge, and the triangles at the bottom are cows that have a very smelly, virulent discharge. And as you'd expect, cows that are sick have a lower dry matter intake after calving. Calving is right here. But what was really interesting was that those cows had dropped in dry matter intake 2 weeks before calving. And as Jesse mentioned this morning, those cows could not have had metritis 2 weeks before calving. So effectively what it's suggesting is that something is driving NEFA up and something is driving disease after calving, but NEFA per se is not driving disease after calving. And there's been a lot of research undertaken since then to actually support that. The other thing is, if you really delve into the work that Sandra Bertix published, and it is a lovely paper, this is not a criticism of the work, it's a criticism of the interpretation from that work that a lot of people have drawn, is that 2 weeks after calving, now there was no liver biopsy 2 weeks after calving, however, we do have NEFA and beta-hydroxybutyrate. And NEFA were 50% higher in blood, and beta-hydroxybutyrate was 100% higher in blood in the force-fed cows. So the force-fed cows were losing far more body condition, far more NEFA being released from adipose tissue, and a failure to oxidize that in the liver. And when we look at that in a pasture-based system, we see the same thing, where we underfed versus overfeeding cows. After calving, on average, the cows that were underfed had 25% lower NEFA concentration circulating in blood, and that was mimicked in beta-hydroxybutyrate as well. Now, to take that a step further, these work that came out of Illinois, this is by Juan Lohr and Jim Drakely, cows that were underfed for 8 weeks before calving had higher, the open diamonds had higher NEFAs before calving, but significantly lower, 30% lower NEFAs after calving. Very similar to Sandra Bertix's data, very similar to our own data. When we look at beta-hydroxybutyrate, we see the same thing, almost a 50 to 70% increase in the concentration of beta-hydroxybutyrate in the weeks after calving in animals that were fed more than their requirements compared with animals that were restricted by 20%. And liver tags after calving were significantly higher in the animals that were overfed as well. So the feed restriction before calving actually lowered NEFA and beta-hydroxybutyrate after calving and lowered liver triglyceride. Now, Juan went a step further and actually looked at the molecular changes in the liver tissue through that time. And we've done a lot of work on this over the last decade. We've got a strong collaboration going between our teams. But this again was just a beautiful, one of the first studies using microarray analysis in the bovine. And what it shows is that cows that were restricted before calving, even 2 weeks before calving, had higher levels of pyruvate carboxylase. That's that rate-limiting enzyme that I talked about earlier for gluconeogenesis. They had higher concentrations of adipore-2, which is used in the oxidation of fatty acids, and they had reduced lipid synthesis. So a 20% restriction resulted in a far healthier liver after calving. So just to summarize there, restricting cows by 20% reduced NEFA and beta-hydroxybutyrate post-calving. It improved liver function and reduced the risk of ketosis. Now, I get asked all the time, how long is the restriction? I'm going to come to what a restriction means in a second, but how long? And the answer is we don't know. So most of the Illinois work, most of the North American work has been for the entire dry period, for 8 weeks. Our work has been for about 3 to 4 weeks. And my practical work on farm, I've seen changes in the space of 2 to 3 days in terms of downer cows going to no downer cows situation. And I do believe it is a 2 to 3 day to a week event. So that Springer cow phenomenon. However, restricting cows by more than 30% increases the risk of ketosis pre-calving, and it reduces milk production after calving. So we need to be in control of this. Our recommendations are that we feed cows 90% of their requirements for the 3 weeks before calving. So a 10% restriction, and we find that that achieves all of the aims that we want. However, it is dependent on body condition score. And very, very quickly here, what we find is an interaction between feeding level and the body condition score of the cows. So you've got two different graphs here. Sorry, wrong one. You've got cows that are a body condition score of 4, which is 2.75, and cows that are a body condition score of 5, which is 3.25 on a 5-point scale. What we find is that cows that are a body condition score of 5, 3 on a 5-point scale, we see lower blood albumin in a linear decrease in blood albumin post-calving, with increasing level of feeding pre-calving, with increasing level of feeding pre-calving, we see a drop in blood albumin post-calving. However, in thinner cows, we see a lower level of blood albumin in cows that were severely restricted by 25%. So there is an interaction with body condition score. I'll skip IL-6, but we see the same story with IL-6. One of the things I do want to say, and I'm going to skip over the next few slides so that I can get a few questions in here, the effect of pre-calving feeding on the risk of milk fever. And this probably speaks somewhat to what Finbar asked Scott before the lunch break. In all of our work, every experiment, without fail, the more we feed a cow before calving, the lower her blood calcium on the day of calving and the day after calving. Exactly the same in the Illinois work, Jim Drakely has told me. So increasing level of feeding before calving reduces blood calcium at calving and increases the risk of milk fever. So look, I'm going to skip over DCAD because it's going to take me too long. Or actually, no, I'll give you one slide. Jesse presented this morning, which showed the work that he did, showing the increased sensitivity to parathyroid hormone in animals that were acidotic, animals that have been fed a DCAD of -15 versus +15. Now, unfortunately, there's been a misinterpretation, I believe a misinterpretation of this meta-analysis, which is an excellent piece of work, has gathered together an awful lot of the work that has been done. And what it's done here is it's fitted a statistical model to urine pH relative to DCAD. And it's almost linear, it's slightly curved, it's almost linear. But if you look at the actual data, what you see is a titration curve. We see no change in urine pH until you get down below a DCAD of 0, and then it plummets. This was one of the first lessons that Jesse gave me, actually, in DCAD, is this phosphate buffering system in urine. But to go a step further, there was a linear statistical model fitted to the risk of milk fever as well. And so what's been inferred from that is that reducing DCAD alone reduces the risk of milk fever. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how anyone could interpret that from this graph. If you get down below 0, as Jesse quite rightly pointed out this morning, we effectively nullify the risk of milk fever. It's gone. Very difficult to do in our system, but it's gone. Above that, we're unable to predict it. And the reason why I've put it in there is I've seen a presentation from our neighbours across the Tasman in the Southern Hemisphere. This is a farmer-friendly resource in Australia, which shows the same graph, but it's taken out all of the data points. And it suggests a linear drop in the risk of milk fever with reducing DCAD, which I think is misleading. All right, so just quickly to conclude, hopefully it's time for a couple of questions. 30 to 50% of calves with FPT still. The quality of the colostrum and the cleanliness of the utensils, I think we've underestimated them, and that needs to be a focus. We need moderate body condition score at calving, somewhere between 2.75 and 3.25. There's a 6-fold greater risk of death during the first month after calving, death or culling. The immune system is compromised, and it doesn't matter what system of farming we're looking at, and we're looking at ways to improve that. And I know that you'll probably hear some more about that tomorrow in Elenco's symposium, or I presume you will. And we've got significant adaptations to energy and protein requirements. So overfeeding of pre-calving cows linked to liver dysfunction, hypercalcemia, and DCAD a very good strategy to reduce milk fever as long as you can consistently get that DCAD down below 0. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, John, for an excellent presentation, and I'd be delighted to take one question at least from the floor. So we have people with microphones. If you have a question, please, if you could raise your hand. One question I have, John, is there's a 0.5 unit range in your target body condition score at calving. I suppose many people might be reluctant to recommend a calving body condition score of 2.75. If they lose even a quarter of a unit, they're almost in an undesirable score then for breeding. They're at 2.5.
Sure.
What's your comment? Are you happy with the group that's at 2.75?
It's interesting. So I had a conversation, I don't know if Mark Lill is in the audience, but I had a conversation with Mark last year about this, and they found, they didn't find the same positive effect of a feed restriction before calving in the work that they did at Hillsborough in Northern Ireland. And when we talked about it, I found that they do calve cows at 2.75, or that's what's recommended. That's what Phil Garnsworthy has been recommending, as I said, for nearly 30 years. I think it really depends on the system that they're going into. So if we're assured that they're going to get an adequate amount of high quality feed after calving, I don't think there's a problem. If they're in a grazing system, then I would prefer to see a buffer of a quarter of a score on top of that.
Okay, do we have a question from the audience?
Blinded with brilliance.
Okay, we'll leave it. Okay, we have one question, excuse me.
So
if you could just state your name and where you're from, please.
Patrick Cumming, I'm from America. A couple slides back, you were talking about, I think, feed intake prior to calving, and when you got up like to 125%, bad things happened, right? But you don't really explain what they're eating. I mean, you can feed a lot of different things and they ain't all the same.
That's a fair point. So it doesn't seem to matter what we're feeding in terms of the underfeeding, controlled feeding versus overfeeding. We've been using pasture and pasture silage, pasture and pasture hay. The Illinois group have obviously been using a fairly typical northern total mixed ration. They've restricted either using straw, chopped straw, or fresh air. We've done the same. We've restricted using fresh air and a view. And if you make it down to New Zealand, we've got plenty of both. But when we look at the effect of starch or the effects of fats, etc., certainly there was an indication from Neil Douglas's PhD that you didn't have the same negative effect of overfeeding using fat as you do with starch. Now, in our diet, we're not using either starch or fat. We're using a fermentable fiber source, and we're still seeing the advantage. Probably not as great an advantage as we see in the North American data, but I think some of that is because our cows are not quite as fat eaters, so they're not as great as risk. All right.
Okay, I'll ask you to give John another round of applause, and I think we'll move on to the next speaker.